Marcus had always loved the city at sunset. The tall buildings caught the last golden light of the day, and the streets filled with a mix of tired workers, students rushing home, and families looking for something to eat. That evening, after a long day at work, he walked toward his favorite food stall at the square. The smell of roasted corn, fried chicken, and sweet bread mixed in the air. People stood in a line, chatting quietly, waiting their turn. Marcus joined the line with a small smile, looking forward to a warm meal before heading home. He stood tall, well dressed in a crisp shirt and jacket, carrying himself with the quiet confidence he had learned over the years. Some people in the line glanced at him, not in a bad way, just noticing his presence. He nodded politely and pulled out his phone to check a few messages while waiting. The evening felt peaceful, like any other normal day. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, this ordinary wait for food would turn into a moment that dozens of strangers would remember for a very long time. Ahead of him in the line was a middle-aged woman. She seemed restless, tapping her foot, muttering under her breath about how slow everything was. She kept checking her watch and sighing loudly. The vendor was working as quickly as he could, serving people with a smile, but clearly, patience was not her strong side. Marcus noticed her shifting from one leg to another, crossing her arms, and sometimes turning around to scan the line as if she were measuring how long it would take. When her turn finally came, she gave her order sharply, her voice higher than normal, almost scolding the vendor. He kept calm and nodded, preparing her food. She looked around again, shaking her head. Marcus, still behind her, kept his calm too. He didn't want trouble. He had lived in the city long enough to know that sometimes, people were simply stressed or frustrated. But sometimes, that frustration found an unfair target. It happened in an instant. She turned around, her eyes landing on Marcus. Maybe it was the fact that he had smiled at something on his phone, maybe it was just the way he stood quietly and confidently. For whatever reason, she decided to release her anger at him. Her voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the chatter of the crowd. "Why don't you go back to Africa?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't your place." The words dropped heavy in the air. Conversations stopped. The vendor froze with the food in his hands. The line behind Marcus went silent. A few people looked down quickly, pretending they hadn't heard, while others stared wide-eyed at the woman. A child in the crowd tugged on his mother's sleeve, whispering a question, but the mother shook her head gently, urging the child to stay quiet. The evening had suddenly changed. The golden sunset seemed colder, the warm smell of food now mixed with tension. Marcus's war the night grew deeper as Marcus walked home, but the weight of the evening did not leave him. His footsteps echoed softly against the quiet streets, yet inside his heart there was still a storm of thoughts. He had never asked to be the center of attention, never wanted to be remembered for moments like this. He had only wanted dinner, a simple meal at the end of a long day. But sometimes, life had a way of pulling people into places where they were tested, where they had to stand firm even when they least expected it. Tonight had been one of those moments, and Marcus knew it would follow him for a long time. By the time he reached his apartment, his phone was already buzzing non-stop. Friends had sent him messages. Some had seen the video already, others were just hearing about it. "That was powerful," one text read. Another said, "Marcus, you've gone viral." He sat on his couch, scrolling through the messages with a small sigh. Going viral was never his goal. He had spoken for himself, for dignity, for truth. But now his words belonged to the world. He opened one of the videos posted online and watched himself standing tall in the square. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the same truth he had felt in his chest. Thousands of comments were already pouring in. People wrote things like, "This gave me hope, and I needed to hear this today." Others shared their own stories of facing hurtful words and finding strength. Some even admitted that they had once spoken in ignorance but that his words made them reflect on their actions. Marcus set the phone down, leaning back. He felt tired but also strangely fulfilled. He realized that while he could not control how others would use his words, he could at least be proud of how he had carried himself. His grandfather had been right, dignity could not be stolen. Tonight, he had protected it, and in doing so, he had reminded others of their own. The next morning, Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through his window. The world outside had already moved forward, but his phone told a different story. The video had spread to news outlets. Headlines carried phrases like "man's calm response to hate leaves crowd in awe" and "dignity in the face of insult." Reporters wanted interviews, community groups wanted him to speak, and strangers from across the globe were sending him messages of support. At first, Marcus didn't know how to respond. He wasn't an activist, wasn't a politician, wasn't a preacher. He was just a man who had spoken from his heart in a public square. But as the hours passed, he began to see that the moment had grown beyond him. It wasn't about him being famous, it was about what his words had unlocked in others. Later that day, as he walked through the same square on his way home from work, he noticed people glancing at him differently. Some smiled, some nodded, some even approached him to shake his hand. An older woman stopped him to say, "You reminded us what it means to speak with courage." "Thank you." A young student asked if she could take a picture with him. Marcus felt humbled. He never wanted to be treated like a symbol, but he realized that sometimes, people needed symbols, reminders of what was possible. Children who had been at the square that night now pointed him out to their parents, whispering, "That's him." Their parents smiled warmly, telling their children, "Yes, that's the man who showed us how to answer with dignity." Marcus greeted them gently, his heart softening at the thought that maybe these young ones would grow up remembering the power of calm truth over anger. As the days went by, invitations began arriving. Schools wanted him to speak to students about courage. Community groups asked him to share his story. Churches and local organizations wanted him to join their conversations about unity and respect. Marcus hesitated at first, unsure if he was the right person. But each time he remembered the silence of that square, the heavy silence before he had spoken, and he knew that if he stayed quiet now, he would be letting that silence win again. So he agreed. At a local high school, he stood before hundreds of students and retold the story of that night. He told them how fear had pressed on his chest, how easy it would have been to snap in anger, and how tempting it would have been to walk away. But he explained why he had chosen dignity instead. Words, he told them, are like seeds. They can plant hate or they can plant hope. You get to decide what grows from your mouth. The students clapped, some even standing, inspired by how someone ordinary could turn an insult into a lesson for the world. At another gathering, an elderly man approached Marcus after his talk. With tears in his eyes, he said, "Son, I lived through years where people told me I didn't belong. I fought with fists, I fought with anger. Sometimes I won, but many times I lost. Watching you that night showed me there is another way. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, that dignity is the greatest strength of all." Marcus hugged him gently, moved by the weight of his words. The video continued to circulate online, reaching even people overseas. Letters arrived in his mailbox from strangers thanking him for giving them courage in their own struggles. Marcus realized he had become part of something much larger than himself. His words had traveled beyond borders, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. Yet, through it all, Marcus remained grounded. He still went to work every day, still stopped by the food stall for dinner, still walked home under the city lights. He never let the attention change who he was. He always reminded himself of the truth: he was not a hero, not a legend, he was just a man who chose dignity in a moment of hate. That choice had made the difference. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus thought about the woman who had told him to go back to Africa. He wondered what had happened to her after she walked away. Did she replay his words in her mind? Did she feel shame? Did she change? He didn't know, and he realized he might never know. But he hoped that maybe, somewhere deep inside, his words had planted a seed that would one day grow into understanding. What mattered most to Marcus was not whether people remembered his name, but whether they remembered the lesson. He wanted them to remember that calm could be more powerful than shouting, that truth could silence lies, that dignity could disarm hate. He wanted them to remember that sometimes, in the face of cruelty, the strongest response is not anger but courage. Years later, people still spoke of that evening in the square. The story was retold in classrooms, in families, in conversations among friends. "Do you remember the man who answered with dignity?" they would say. And each time it was told, it carried the same power, reminding people of what was possible. For Marcus, life continued. He grew older, his hair turning silver, his steps slower. But the memory of that night never faded. It lived inside him like a light, reminding him that even ordinary people could make extraordinary choices. And whenever he passed through the square, he would pause, look at the spot where it had happened, and feel a quiet pride. He had not shouted. He had not fought. He had simply spoken truth. And in doing so, he had left a crowd speechless, given strangers hope, and reminded the world of the strength that lives inside dignity. Square slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but something in the air had changed. People no longer stood with the same casual indifference they had when waiting for food. They carried themselves with a certain awareness, as if they had just lived through a story that would stay with them. Conversations picked up again, but the topic on nearly every lip was not the food or the evening plans, it was Marcus and the way he had responded. Marcus, sitting on the bench, finished his meal quietly, though he felt far from alone. Every few minutes, someone would approach him, some with words, others with nothing more than a nod or a gentle pat on the shoulder. A woman in her 40s paused in front of him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "You reminded us what strength really looks like." Marcus gave her a small smile, acknowledging her words without adding more. He had already spoken enough for the night. But the crowd itself wasn't done. A group of students sat together on the ground near the fountain, replaying the video one of them had taken. Each time Marcus's words echoed from the small screen, they reacted again with murmurs of agreement. "Did you hear how calm he was?" one said. "That's what made it so powerful." Another added, "It's like he didn't even need to raise his voice. The truth spoke for him." Farther away, a man in a suit who had been silent during the incident now spoke to his colleagues. "I feel ashamed," he admitted. "I wanted to say something when that woman spoke, but I froze. He did what I couldn't. He stood up with words I wish I had found." His colleagues nodded, each of them reflecting on their own silence. Marcus noticed this change. He saw people turning to each other, confessing their fears, their regrets, their admiration. It wasn't just about him, it was about what the moment had sparked inside everyone. He realized that dignity could not only silence hate but also awaken courage in those who had been afraid. Not everyone reacted the same way. A few muttered quietly that it was just words and that nothing really changes. But even those voices sounded weaker, as if the power of Marcus's response had drained the force from their doubts. The applause from earlier still lingered in their ears, reminding them that something important had happened. A young man wearing headphones approached Marcus cautiously. He looked restless, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Sir," he said, "I just want to tell you. I've dealt with things like that too. I usually just walk away. But the way you handled it, it made me think maybe I don't always have to stay silent." His voice shook slightly, but his eyes shone with determination. Marcus nodded at him, replying gently, "Walking away takes strength too. But sometimes, when the time feels right, your voice can teach more than your silence ever could." The young man nodded again, as if those words gave him something he had been searching for. He walked off with a straighter back than before. The square grew darker as the evening deepened, but the crowd lingered. Streetlights cast soft pools of yellow light on the pavement, and the fountain sparkled with reflections. People didn't seem to want to leave just yet. It was as if they were clinging to the atmosphere Marcus had created. Even the vendor, usually quick to pack up after dark, moved slower, smiling quietly as he watched the scene unfold. Then something unexpected happened. A police officer walked through the square on his regular patrol. Curious about the unusual gathering, he approached a small group of people and asked what had happened. Almost instantly, several voices tried to explain at once. They told him about the woman's insult, about the silence that followed, and about Marcus's powerful response. The officer listened carefully, his expression shifting from surprise to respect. Finally, he walked over to Marcus himself. "I heard you handled a situation here with a lot of grace," the officer said. "Wish more people did things like that. You probably stopped it from turning ugly." Marcus looked up, meeting his eyes. "I didn't do it to stop her," he said softly. "I did it to remind myself and everyone else that we belong. That truth is stronger than hate." The officer gave a slow nod, then tipped his hat before continuing on his patrol. By now, the recording of Marcus's response had traveled far beyond the square. Phones buzzed with notifications as the video spread through social media. People who hadn't been there were now watching, reacting, and sharing their own thoughts. Some wrote, "This is how you handle ignorance." Others said, "His words gave me chills." Within the hour, Marcus's face and voice had reached thousands of screens across the city, and soon, across the country. Back in the square, a new energy began to rise. A group of people, emboldened by what they had seen, began speaking openly about their own experiences with prejudice. One woman told the crowd how she had stayed quiet at her workplace when a coworker made a hurtful joke. Another man admitted he had once been the one to say cruel words, and tonight he realized how wrong he had been. The space became something more than a square. It became a place of shared truth, born out of Marcus's calm courage. Marcus listened, though he didn't join in these new conversations. He felt humbled, almost surprised, that his simple decision to answer with dignity had blossomed into something larger. He sat quietly, letting others take the stage now. The spotlight had shifted from him to the people around him, who were finally finding their voices. A woman in a bright red coat approached him after sharing her own story. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "What you did tonight, it gave us permission to speak. Sometimes it only takes one person to break the silence." Marcus looked at her, his eyes thoughtful, and replied, "Sometimes it only takes one person to remind us that silence doesn't have to win." The square grew thinner as people eventually drifted away, but the spirit of the evening lingered. Those who left carried with them not just the memory of Marcus's words but also the realization that they too had a choice in how they responded to hate. For many, the choice would never feel the same again. Marcus finally stood, stretching his legs. He threw away his food container and took one last look around the square. It was quieter now, but he could still feel the echo of applause, still see the faces turned toward him in silence. He thought about the woman who had started it all. She had left in anger and shame, but perhaps even she, later that night, would think about his words. Maybe she would remember that he hadn't answered with bitterness, but with truth. And maybe, just maybe, it would plant a seed of change inside her too. As he walked away, Marcus felt a strange mix of exhaustion and peace. His day had begun like any other, yet it had ended with a moment that touched countless lives. He hadn't planned it, but sometimes life chose its own teachers, and tonight, he had been one. The city lights flickered as he crossed the street, heading toward home. His steps were steady, his head held high. Behind him, the square returned to its ordinary self, but for those who had been there, it would never be just another evening again. DS still hung in the air like a melody that refused to fade. The crowd was buzzing, yet strangely respectful, as if they all knew they had just witnessed something that would not leave their minds quickly. The clapping had slowed, but the effect remained. People were whispering to each other, repeating his words as though they wanted to memorize them. The woman who had started the chaos was gone, but the space she left behind was filled with the echo of dignity. Marcus stayed where he was for a few seconds longer, his chest rising and falling slowly. He had not raised his voice, yet his words had carried across the square as if powered by something deeper. He hadn't planned them, they had come from his heart, pulled out by the moment. He could feel the energy around him. People were looking at him not as a stranger, but as someone who had spoken a truth they all needed to hear. A man stepped forward from the crowd. He was older, his hair grey, his shoulders slightly bent with age. He tapped his cane once on the ground before speaking. "Son," the man said, his voice low but strong, "that was the finest answer I've heard in my life. You spoke for many of us today." His words were met with nods of agreement from those standing nearby. Marcus bowed his head slightly in thanks, but still kept quiet. He didn't want to turn the moment into a performance. Behind him, a young woman with a backpack raised her phone. She had been recording the entire time, her hands trembling slightly. "The world needs to see this," she whispered to her friend. Her friend nodded, eyes wide, already pulling out her own phone to check the video. Marcus noticed but said nothing. He knew once something was recorded, it would travel beyond the square. Whether that was good or bad, only time would tell. The vendor, still behind his stall, finally placed Marcus's food on the counter. "Brother," he said softly, "your meal is on me today." That was powerful. Marcus smiled faintly, accepting the food with a polite nod. He had not spoken for a reward, but kindness was kindness, and he was grateful. Around him, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Strangers who moments earlier had been silent, afraid to intervene, were now full of energy. They spoke not about the woman's insult, but about Marcus's response. A mother told her teenage son, "That is how you handle hate, with strength, not with shouting." A group of college students repeated the lines he had said, each word passing between them like a secret worth holding on to. Marcus took a small step away from the stall, and the crowd instinctively gave him space, not out of fear, but out of respect. It felt as if they saw him differently now, not just a man waiting in line for food, but someone who had stood tall for more than himself. He felt the weight of it. He hadn't expected to carry such responsibility when he left work that evening, but here it was, sitting on his shoulders like an invisible cloak. One man, younger and louder than the rest, finally broke through the noise. "You shut her down good, man," he said with a grin. "That's what I'm talking about." Marcus turned to him, meeting his excited eyes. "It's not about shutting anyone down," Marcus replied calmly. "It's about lifting ourselves up." His tone softened the man's grin, turning it into a thoughtful nod. People listened closely to every word, as if Marcus's calm presence still commanded their attention. He did not plan to give a speech, yet each sentence that left his mouth seemed to add to the moment. "When we answer hate with hate," he continued, "nothing changes. But when we answer it with truth, the truth speaks louder than anger ever could." The crowd murmured in agreement, their nods spreading like a wave. The young woman who had been recording looked down at her phone again, her eyes wet. She whispered, "This is going to give people hope." Marcus looked at her kindly but didn't reply. He wasn't thinking about the internet or views or likes. He was thinking about the children who had heard those ugly words, the children who might one day hear something similar directed at them. He hoped they would remember not the insult, but the response. As the crowd slowly began to settle, the air filled again with the smell of food and the sound of voices, but something was different. The square no longer felt like an ordinary public place. It felt like a space where something important had taken place, something that had touched everyone present. People lingered even after getting their food, wanting to hold on to the moment. Marcus finally found a bench on the edge of the square. He sat down, his meal still warm in its container. He took a bite, chewing slowly, his mind replaying what had just happened. He wondered if he had said the right words. He wondered if he had done enough. He wondered if perhaps silence would have been easier. But deep inside, he knew silence would have been a wound, not a cure. His words had healed something, not only in himself but in the crowd. A young boy walked up to him shyly, the same boy who had tugged his mother's arm earlier. His small eyes looked up at Marcus with admiration. "Sir," the boy said softly, "you were like a hero just now." Marcus chuckled gently, shaking his head. "No, son," he said. "I'm just a man. But sometimes being a man means standing tall, even when someone tries to push you down." The boy nodded as if he understood, then ran back to his mother, who mouthed a silent thank you to Marcus. The recording was already making its way through phones in the crowd. Strangers sent it to friends, captioning it with words like powerful, inspiring, and must watch. Within minutes, it had spread beyond the square, reaching people across the city. Marcus did not yet know that his voice was traveling far beyond where he sat. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter, as though a heavy weight had lifted from his chest. The sun had almost set now, the golden glow replaced by the deep blue of evening. Street lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the square. People were still whispering about the moment as they walked away, some shaking their heads at the woman's words, others praising Marcus's calm strength. The vendor closed his stall slowly, still smiling at the thought of what he had witnessed. Marcus sat quietly, finishing his meal, not needing applause, not needing praise. What mattered most was that he had stayed true to himself, that he had answered hate with dignity. He knew tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but tonight, he had given strangers a memory they would carry with them. He looked up at the darkening sky, the stars beginning to peek through. Somewhere, he thought, his ancestors were smiling. Somewhere, his grandfather's voice was nodding in approval. And somewhere, deep within himself, Marcus felt peace. The square was still wrapped in silence after the woman's words, but it was not just silence. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, where people knew something important was about to happen. Marcus could feel that weight pressing on his shoulders. It was strange he had not asked to be in this moment, yet somehow it had found him. The eyes of strangers were fixed on him, waiting to see if he would bend under the insult or rise above it. His heart beat faster than usual, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. He remembered his childhood, when he had first faced hurtful words in school. He could still see himself as a little boy, standing in a playground while others laughed at him because of the color of his skin. Back then, he had wanted to cry, but his grandmother had pulled him close later that evening and said, "Never let their words decide your worth, child. You are more than their ignorance." Those words had stayed with him through the years, and now they returned to him like a guiding light. The woman stood in front of him, her arms crossed tight, her face stiff with anger. She looked as if she was daring him to shout, daring him to lose control so she could say she had been right about him. But Marcus knew better. He had lived long enough to see how quickly anger could be twisted, how easily it could be used against people like him. If he raised his voice, someone in the crowd might only remember the noise, not the truth. But if he stayed calm, every word would strike deeper than shouting ever could. The vendor still had her food in his hands. His eyes shifted nervously between Marcus and the woman, unsure of whether to step in or keep quiet. A man in the back of the line shifted his weight but said nothing. A teenage girl holding a notebook looked like she wanted to speak but couldn't bring herself to do it. No one wanted to make the first move. The responsibility had fallen to Marcus. He closed his eyes for a second, gathering himself. In that brief darkness, he thought of his ancestors, of the people who had survived chains, ships, and fields, yet still held their heads high. He thought of his father, who had worked 2 jobs so that Marcus could attend college, who had taught him that dignity was something no one could take unless you handed it away. He thought of the children in the crowd, watching this moment, perhaps shaping their own understanding of courage from what they were about to see. When he opened his eyes, the silence felt different. It was no longer just heavy, it was expectant. The crowd leaned toward him, hungry for an answer. His body trembled slightly, but his voice, when he finally allowed it to rise, came out steady, slow, and clear. But before he spoke, he let another pause hang in the air. That pause was not weakness, it was power. Each second he remained quiet was another second where the woman's insult lost its sharpness, where the crowd's attention shifted away from her anger and toward his calm. She frowned, shifting uncomfortably, no longer so sure of herself. Marcus thought about how easy it would be to walk away, to let the moment pass without a word. But then he looked at the faces around him. He saw the young boy holding his mother's hand. He saw the old man gripping his cane with both hands. He saw the students in the crowd with backpacks slung over their shoulders. They were all watching him. And deep inside, Marcus knew that walking away would leave the moment unfinished. This was not about winning an argument, it was about teaching something without a lecture. His lips parted, but still he did not rush. Instead, he looked the woman in the eyes. She blinked, unsettled by his steady gaze. The crowd waited, some holding their breath. Finally, Marcus spoke, his words slow, measured, and carrying the weight of generations. "You don't know me," he began. "And yet you think you can tell me where I belong." The crowd stirred slightly, but remained quiet. The woman shifted, her smirk faltering. Marcus's voice did not rise in anger, but it carried a strength that filled the square. He continued, "This place you stand on, this city, this country, it was not built by just one kind of person. My ancestors worked the soil, laid the tracks, built the homes, and fought in wars. They shed their blood here, though no one asked them if they belonged. If you tell me to go back, then you should know I never left. My roots are here, in this ground, in this history, in this struggle." The words had not been planned, yet they came out like poetry, pulled from his heart by the moment itself. The woman opened her mouth to reply but found no words. The crowd was hanging on every sentence, their silence now heavy with respect instead of fear. Marcus paused again, letting his words settle like dust after a storm. His voice softened slightly, but the strength remained. "Africa is part of me, yes. It's my history, my blood, my song. But America is in my veins too. It is in my dreams, in my work, in the hope I carry every day. This country belongs to me as much as it belongs to anyone else. So no, I will not go back. I am already home." The silence broke, not with chatter, but with the sound of someone clapping. It was soft at first, just a pair of hands meeting together. Then another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the square was filled with the sound of applause. People who had been too afraid to speak found their voices in the rhythm of their hands. The woman's face flushed red as she realized the crowd was no longer on her side. She looked down at her food, then at Marcus, then away, as if she wished she could disappear. Marcus did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply stood still, breathing deeply, feeling the release of the tension in his chest. He knew that applause would fade, that life would return to normal, but for this moment, he had shown everyone something different. Strength was not always in raising your voice, it was sometimes in keeping it steady when the world tried to shake you. The clapping grew louder. A young man near the front shouted, "That's right." Someone else said, "Tell her." But Marcus didn't speak again. He let his words stand as they were, enough to fill the silence that had once been filled with hate. The woman turned away quickly, snatching her food from the vendor and hurrying off through the crowd. She left behind the echo of her words, but those echoes were drowned beneath the applause, beneath the memory of Marcus's calm response. People would not remember her insult as much as they would remember the dignity with which he answered it. The vendor finally broke into a smile, nodding at Marcus. The young boy tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "He was brave." The mother nodded, her eyes shining. Strangers smiled at Marcus, not with pity but with respect. And though the moment had been painful at first, Marcus realized he had turned it into something else, a lesson that silence could not hide from, a truth that could not be denied. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The sting of those words wasn't new. He had heard things like that before, growing up in neighborhoods where not everyone welcomed someone who looked like him. But still, no matter how many times it happened, it never stopped hurting. He lowered his phone slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the anger in her face, but also something else, something empty, like she wasn't really angry at him, but at her own life, and he had simply become her target. He glanced around. Every eye was on him. The crowd waited. Some people looked sympathetic, others nervous, and a few curious, almost entertained. But nobody spoke. The silence pressed down like a heavy blanket. Marcus thought about how easy it would be to snap back, to raise his voice, to throw her words right back at her. But another thought came, stronger. He remembered his grandfather's voice from years ago, teaching him that real strength wasn't shown in shouting, but in control. Dignity, Marcus, his grandfather used to say. Never let someone steal your dignity. He stood there, taking in the moment. His heart pounded. He could feel his hands wanting to clench into fists, but he held them still. He thought about the people watching, the young boy in the crowd, the teenage girl holding a backpack, the old man leaning on his cane. If he reacted with anger, they would only remember a fight. But if he responded with calm strength, maybe they would remember something bigger. The woman crossed her arms, waiting, almost daring him to answer. A faint smirk played at her lips, as if she had already won by making him uncomfortable. Marcus kept his eyes steady on her, not with hate, but with something deeper, patience mixed with quiet fire. Inside, he thought of his ancestors, of the long journey that had brought him here. He thought about the history his family carried, about the sacrifices that allowed him to stand in this very spot, free, educated, proud. The crowd still held its breath. No one moved. A man near the back coughed softly, then stopped, realizing even that small sound felt too loud in the heavy silence. It was as if the entire square had become a stage, and Marcus was at the center. He realized his response would not just be for himself, it would be for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. He inhaled slowly, his chest rising, and let the breath out with care. He did not rush to speak. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, making every second heavier. The woman's smirk faded slightly as she noticed his calmness. Her own anger seemed to lose some of its fire. Marcus straightened his back, raised his chin, and prepared to speak, not with rage, but with the weight of truth. The moment before his first word felt endless. The vendor, still holding the woman's order, leaned slightly forward, almost forgetting about the food. The child clung to his mother's arm. Strangers who had never met Marcus, strangers who would probably never see him again, were waiting for him to answer. And in that small pause, Marcus realized something powerful. He had control of the moment. Not her, not her insult. Him. And when he finally opened his mouth to speak, the first sound of his voice was calm, steady, and filled with a quiet strength that made every person there lean in.